Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. It is Thursday, January 9th. This week, people are bundled up coming into work here at the station, wearing layers and heavy coats. You're probably seeing a lot of cold weather attire around you, too. People in other parts of the country, though, they would love to be dealing with these temperatures we consider unusually chilly. That made us wonder, why are we so stunned by these cold conditions? Does something physically change in our bodies as Central Floridians, or is it all in our heads? Dr. Andy Little is an emergency medicine physician at AdventHealth East Orlando ER. He joined Engage this morning to talk about what's real and what's myth. I began our discussion by asking if there is, in fact, a physiological change our bodies go through when we move from one extreme climate to another.
It really just comes down to conditioning. So if you want to get a little nerdy, which we can for a second, the science behind how we get cold is that our skin feels a cold sensation, and it sends a signal to our brain, hey, I'm cold. And then our body sends signals to our little arteries in the peripheral parts of our skin, and they vasoconstrictor, they get small to pool blood back to our vital organs. And so we are no longer heating our extremities, which is why we get cold. And so what happens is that when we go from cold climates to warm climates, or warm climates to cold climates, is the longer we're away from a cold climate, the less our body is acclimated at handling the cold. And so when we go back home for Christmas or back home for a holiday and it's a cold weekend, it's because our body's not used to doing that. But if you notice, if we're there for a couple of days, on the fourth, fifth, or sixth day, our body handles the cold better because I'm in cold mode. And so it knows to send that signal a little better at helping at warm parts of your body, i.e. your hands and your feet. Where if you live in Florida or a warm climate all the time, and we get those handful of cold nights in the year, we can't handle it because we're not used to having to do that. We haven't done that exercise in a while. So just like when you run for the first time in a couple months, our body has to get used to making itself warm again. So yeah.
Okay, so there's actually science to it. It's not just kind of all in our heads.
It's not all in our, well, I mean, it does come from our brain, but it's not all in our heads. Yeah.
Okay. So that makes me, why do we, when we get cold, what's with shivering, teeth chattering? What's that response?
Yeah, so when we talked about that, that initial response of cold to the brain and then back, but when we stay cold for a period of time and our body is, again, sending most of our blood to our vital organs, our extremities are designed to shiver, because when we shiver, what's happening is our muscles are twitching, and that is actually sending a signal back to our brain of, hey, we need more of a blood supply. So our body then shunts blood back to the muscles, which then warms our extremities. And so it's one of our, hey, we've been cold for too long, you need to reheat us. And shivering is one of the biofeedback loops that our body uses.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Is this a topic that patients address with you in your current role? Do patients come into the emergency room thinking that, maybe I'm dealing with something serious with this cold?
Now, there are medical conditions that make this worse. And so in the emergency department and during cold spells, we will see a number of patients, particularly people with a history of diabetes. And the issue with diabetes is as you get peripheral neuropathy, your body is not as good at sending those receptors back to your brain that it's cold. People with hypothyroidism, which is your thyroid's one of the regulatory organs that secrete a specific enzyme that help us stay warm and cold. And then if you have peripheral vascular disease, so if you've got whether it's in your arteries or your veins, and that's typically people who have had strokes, people who are chronic smokers, and people who have had heart attacks, they also have a problem because those vessels that get big and get small to regulate your temperature don't work as well. And so during cold spells, we'll get a number of people coming in feeling cold, and it's just because their baseline medical problems make it harder for them to regulate their body temperature.
Okay, so these are kind of people who maybe are more at risk already.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yeah.
Is there a temperature where, as an ER doctor, your brain or your head, you say, this is going to be a problem versus this is going to be uncomfortable?
It's one of those where early on in my career, I had this idea that, anything under, 50 degrees was going to be a problem. But when you look at the science, anything really below 70, because of ambient temperatures, if you have prolonged exposure without a rewarming episode, can cause problems to where you'll see in major cities like Orlando, even in the summertime, we'll get hypothermic patients because at night it drops in the 70s. They're sleeping on the ground, they're sleeping on a park bench, and those are typically things that hold temperature really well. And so you've got a 98-degree body laying on a 70-degree ground, and eventually those temperatures are going to match. And so when we get below 92 degrees, some of our organs don't work as well, our brain, our kidneys, our lungs, and our heart. And so it's really any temperature below 70, you're at risk for having episodes of hypothermia, and that's in a dry environment. And then if you add a wet environment, so if it's in the 70s and raining, that's even worse because when you're wet, your body has more problems regulating its body temperature. And so again, there's this misconception it's got to be really cold outside to get hypothermia, but you can get hypothermia on a sunny summer day if you lay on the ground and you're wet and you don't go rewarm yourself.
Interesting. As we're talking, my mom's voice is creeping in my head. Bundle up or you'll catch a cold. Can we talk about that mom advice? Is there the correlation between being cold and catching a cold?
Yeah, there definitely is. So when our body temperature is lower, our immune system doesn't function as well. And so there is a chance that if you're around people who are already sick out in the cold and you're not dressed warm enough, you are at increased risk of getting whatever disease they have, whether at this time of year, whether it's COVID, influenza, parainfluenza, or one of the other respiratory viruses. So if it's cold outside and you have a chance of being around somebody that's sick, I do recommend, bundling up, wearing a coat. If you feel a scarf's appropriate for you or a hat, those are all things that will help prevent a disease because you'll be able to regulate your body temperature better and help your immune system be optimized.
I'm throwing my parents under the bus here again, but when I go home to visit them, it feels like they keep their house at, 700 degrees. Is there something age related to this? As we get older, we have less tolerance for cold?
Yeah, and there is, because all the things we talked about before. So elderly patients are more likely to have undiagnosed peripheral vascular disease, undiagnosed diabetes. And then as our nerves get older and as our body gets older, body temperature regulation becomes harder to manage because all the organs involved just don't function like they used to. So there is a correlation with people over 65 having a higher predominance of issues with body temperature regulation. So just like when I go visit my parents for Christmas, they've got the temperature at 78 and nobody else is comfortable and they think it's amazing because they're in their 70s and for them, that's beautiful. So yeah, as we get age, it's harder to do.
I feel like once they're at that age, like they've earned the right, if they want to keep their house at 78, go for it.
Agreed.
Yes. Dr. Little, does this happen on the converse? Do people experience, if a Central Floridian moves to Maine, are they going to struggle in, the opposite temperatures too?
Yeah, I think it's one of those where whenever you move climates and change temperature, like demographics, your body has to get acclimatized. And so as someone who grew up in Montana and then moved to Ohio, spent 30 years in Ohio, and now has been in Central Florida for 4.5 years, it's amazing how quickly, even though I've only been gone for 4.5 years from Ohio, when I went home for Christmas, it took me a couple of days to get used to the cold, where before the cold was just something I was used to. And vice versa, to where when it gets really hot here in the summer, when I go home to Columbus and it's nice outside, I'm amazed at how when I bring family back in the summer, how quickly they can't handle the heat. And to me, it's like it's just normal. So again, it's what your body's used to. And as long as you have time to acclimatize to that, eventually you get used to the extremes in cold and in heat. It's just when you have a drastic change in temperature is the problem.
That was Dr. Andy Little, the program director of AdventHealth's Emergency Medicine Program. There's more ahead here on Engage. A car crash in Orlando unraveled the fabric of Carolyn Moor's life when she suddenly became a single mom after her husband's death. How she started an entire movement for widows' care. If you miss any part of our show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen whenever it is convenient for you. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, we'll talk with a couple that has authored a travel log highlighting attractions in Central Florida that don't involve the theme parks. First, though, Carolyn Moor had the perfect life, one she described as a fairy tale.
37 years old, I had a 2 and 4-year-old daughters. My husband, Chad, was an interior architect. We had an interior design firm, 50 people, fairly new, a 3-year business, successful. We just built a dream home.
But that all changed one February night in Orlando.
We were out on a romantic date on Valentine's Day, and on our way home, a hit and run driver crashed into our car right near Lake Eola, and it caused our car to spin out of control. And we hit a light pole. That light pole came down, hit his head, and he died within 24 hours of severe head trauma. And I survived. And my life was devastated in just a second that I could not control. So it was a very tragic ending to a very beautiful evening.
In addition to being just heartbroken, Carolyn was overwhelmed by her new reality. She did not have the resources she needed as a suddenly single mother. The world around her moved on as normal, but she was alone to live the life she and her husband had created together. In time, she founded Modern Widows Club to create the network of long-term support for women that she couldn't find through her grief. Carolyn Moor joined Engage to talk about how the club has grown from her experience into a nationwide movement for widow care. I began the conversation by asking Carolyn how she approached informing her children they had lost their father.
The saving grace, I think, for me was I had been a pediatric nurse before I was an interior designer. So I understood child psychology. I understood that if any kind of a trauma we experienced with children under the age of 6, 7 years old is catastrophic to the trajectory of their life. I immediately knew that my entire energy and my priority was going to need to be them. How to stabilize our life, how to handle the survivor's guilt, the PTSD, the depression, the fear in my life, and to preserve the innocence that they had. I couldn't prevent them from the confusing lack of ability to understand grief. I absorbed a lot of that pain as a parent, knowing what it is that they lost. At 2 years old, my daughter has no memories of her dad. My 4-year-old does have some memories. So it was really a complete prioritization of the energy that I had in a 24-hour span of time. And I had to reconstruct my entire life.
You were in your mid-late 30s when this happened.
Yes.
I don't think many people think of that age when they talk about widows.
And they shouldn't. Statistically, at age 40, only 1% of the female population is widowed. So I was under 1% of the female population that was widowed. That's why there were so few resources for me. Now, fast forward to age 85, and 73% of the female population is widowed. So there's widows of all decades. If you're of age to get married, you're of age to get widowed. 70% of all married women become widowed. That's what I didn't know.
That's a sobering statistic to hear. How did we get from your personal experience, what you went through, and creating this Modern Widows Club in Orlando?
It was really born out of just a lack of resources and a frustration, to be honest with you. I moved forward with my life in my business world as best as I could in my personal life. And I presented well. I wore a mask every day. And so people would send widows in my direction, in which I had no time to volunteer. I really was overextended as a solo parent mom and running a business. So there wasn't much time. And in 2011, I decided that I think it was time for me to support another widow. I felt like I was strong enough to do that. So two of my interior design clients, actually, I agreed to meet with these two ladies, and I had a free Thursday of the month. And so I just said, I'll have dinner with them. It started very innocent like that. But when I sat down with these two ladies, they were so different. One had younger children, one had older children. One was a stay-at-home mom, one was a professional mom. And I think it was just the diversity of the women that were being sent to me, and how you couldn't really profile who a widow was. And yet when you talk to them, they're going through very similar issues: financial health, emotional and mental health, spiritual health, relational health. They're still going through the same very similar patterns and circumstances. And so I just became friends with these ladies, and I learned the universal rule, which is widows know widows. Because when widows can't go searching, they get connected to other widows. And so we were never three ever again, because those two ladies wanted to invite ladies. And that is how the ripple effect of creating a national organization, Modern Widows Club, happened.
So you literally went from dinner to a national presence. How far-reaching is it now?
Well, it was amazing because it was happening right when social media was happening as well. The younger generation, may not remember when Facebook started, but in 2009, 10, 11, it was all the rage, right? So when Modern Widows Club started a Facebook page, all you have to do is search for widow groups and it would pop up. There weren't very many of them. So the growth happened really from social media, was instrumental in our growth. That's where women would reach out at the middle of the night when they couldn't sleep. And it just grew from there. And then, of course, other social sites. But women started wanting to start communities in their area, but they didn't want to do it alone. They didn't want to do it solo. And so one of the great things that has happened at MWC is we really identified that women who step up and support other widows need support. So the leadership level and the leadership training and the leadership support is what was missing. And that is what we actually created, was this leadership level, so that even leaders weren't doing it solo.
What does that support look like? How do you provide it?
Mm-hmm. Well, the beautiful thing is, especially with the pandemic, we were already doing Zoom. We were already having Zoom support meetings long before, the whole world started doing it. That's how we knew that there was so little support locally, that actually virtual support was the only way that we really could find one another. And so that support, it looks like, bringing different support professionals on calls so that they can learn how to hold space with widows, because the stories are very emotional and very really deeply personal and very vulnerable. So we bring in and we encourage speakers to come into our communities. That could be anything from real estate to financial planning to doctors talking about the hormone impact and changes in your body that are going to affect you. Support is in what we call the 7 pillars of healthy widowhood. And so emotional and mental support and financial support are usually the first 2 things that these ladies are needing, because that's the world that they've been thrown into. And then it expands, to relational health and physical health and spiritual health. And then we have to teach ladies how to have fun and be creative again, because they have to give themselves permission to live And then ultimately, everyone wants to find purpose and meaning in the loss. And that is what we call the Hope, Heal, Grow, Lead Healthy Widowhood pathway. But those are the breakdowns of all the different components that are built into all of our programs and services because in the beginning we were a social club, but now we realize we're a women's health organization. We just happen to focus on widowed women only.
Is this why MWC, Modern Widows Club, now also includes Modern Widows Care?
Yep, the movement for widow care. So this last year, we spent so much time talking to legislators and asking where do widows fit into the established institutions that take care of health and care in the United States. And unfortunately, we don't fit in anywhere specifically at the moment, whether we're needing to be listed under a vulnerable population or a survivor population. Right now, that's not recognized in any of our health institutions. And so that became a really big issue that if policies are not addressing, that means research is not going to address widowhood. And then that is what perpetuates the lack of support. That was my big question, was why? Why are there so many widows and why is there so little support? That was the maze in the puzzle that I was interested in solving. And it took talking to thousands of widows and seeing where they get stuck, where they find dead ends, where they reach out and there is nothing. And seeing that all of that as a broader landscape, I think very few people have really stepped back and looked at it as a public health issue that it actually is, a public health crisis for women.
When you're encountering these obstacles to getting the widows the care that they need, what do you do now that you've identified them? How do you move forward?
Well, the care, the direct services has already been built. So the communities, the leadership, the e-courses, the widow empowerment quiz tool that we have that is so phenomenal. It helps ladies understand where they are in Hope, Heal, Grow, Lead. And then we have programs in each one of those areas to help them rebuild their life. And the reality is I think the advocacy and the education and the awareness was always happening. It was just happening in a silo. It was only happening with widows, right? And so you get enough widows that get frustrated, then you take them up to Tallahassee, you take them to DC, you take them and you start asking a lot of questions. Some of the things that we found out are there's no such thing as a widowhood caucus. Caucuses are special interest groups. If there's a special interest group for so many things, so many areas that feeling a lack of inclusion, and that's where we are now. Now we are having to break through the barriers in the health conversations for women. We are having to break barriers in the human rights conversations for women. It's women who are survivors aren't just from domestic violence and from human trafficking. Widowhood is a survival. It's a survival mission. And so we have to interject ourselves into those spaces and say, we want to be included in this conversation. We want a place at the table to talk about the great needs that widowed women have, and they need equal support as well. And this is an extreme lack of actual health care going to 1 million women every year. 1 million women every 2 hours in this country, a woman becomes widowed. And yet no one is telling her where to go for support. That's the reality of if we had every 2 hours someone experiencing domestic violence or being trafficked, there would be services for them, but there's not for widowed women.
I know you're seeking LGBTQ plus community advocates. Would you tell me about your vision for this group that you're trying to launch this year and what you identified, why you wanted to create this?
Well, it's both personal and professional for me. I do have a daughter who is lesbian, and when she married, it opened my eyes to the great needs. But I was involved in a table talk that was put on with Central Florida Foundation and Dignity Memorial, and I learned about the lack of equality in death care for the LGBTQ community. And that really piqued my interest. And I thought, if they're experiencing a not so optimal experience in death care, wow, what happens after they leave a funeral or a memorial for their loved one? And so I reached out to Central Florida Foundation and asked, can you help us? We have we have over 200 widows that identify as being in the LGBTQ community. So if you could help us, fund us to create that, we could here from Central Florida create an actual national virtual community. And because I have two daughters, right? One of them falls into that category. And there is very little support for the LGBTQ. We focus on women. And I thought there has to be leaders. And so now we're starting to identify the leaders, and they will create a monthly call. They will start to create a community. And soon we have to have two women who are past their second year. And then we put them through a training that we have that's virtual. It's a hybrid. We have a program manager that works with them. And then that person supports them year long, because things will come up and struggles will happen with having conversations with widows. So the LGBTQ community is another level of a lack of inclusion, in widowhood. And so we want to be an organization that is very compassionate and open to serving that community.
I'm curious why you said after their second year. Is there significance to that?
Yes. Well, I learned because I started the first Modern Widows Club on my own. I was certainly past my second year, but I truly believe that women need to focus on their own healing and their own growth for the first 2 years. And it has been proven again and again. The entire rebuilding process of your self-identity, once you lose your identity as a spouse, takes somewhere from 5 to 7 years. But the first 2 years are reserved for the actual bereavement and the grief process. And you can't really predict what it's going to be for anyone, but we have found that 2 years is a great marker to be able to serve, to have moved forward enough to be able to have the capacity to reach back and serve others.
When I asked you in the beginning to take me back to 2000, you described it as if it was something that happened last week. In your process, did you have a moment, or was there a time when you realized, I'm going to be okay?
I don't think there was just a moment. I think after being on Oprah, that was a very reflective moment, because I was portrayed as this woman who was an everyday hero and was, living in a neighborhood that just that helped others, and they saw me in this heroic like the hero's journey view. And I didn't see myself that way. I was struggling to get a shower. I didn't understand much about what was happening to me. I felt like I was on a roller coaster wearing a mask most of the time. So it was after I came home from Oprah, I said, well, are you that woman or not? And if you are, you need to become her. If they see it in you, why can't you see it in you? And that's a big part of what happens at MWC. I see the future them. And that's what happened to me. So with that moment, I said, do I see myself as a hero? Here I am raising my kids. Here I am running a business. Here I am doing the best that I possibly can. That's heroic. That's what heroes look like. They keep going. And I think that was the moment that I just said, I'm going to be okay because I professed it to be so. You become that person that they just saw. And it really did change the trajectory of my life.
Carolyn, do you have any advice for people who want to help someone who has lost their spouse or partner? Perhaps they're not a widow themselves, but I think we all know someone who is dealing with something like this.
They really are. Every family has someone, or friendship circle has someone who's widowed. This is probably the most common life event to happen to everyone. So we developed something called the Widow Supporter Newsletter. And it's on our website, modernwidowsclub.org, and it's under resources. And there's resources there for widows, but there's also resources there for friends and family. And that newsletter comes to you for, I think, once every couple weeks for 6 months. And it gives you an inside view of what's really happening to the person that you're watching who's widowed. The secret world of being widowed. And what it does is it gives them a little bit of a confidence level in how to support them. And that what we have found is we actually surveyed a large majority of our widows, and we asked them, if you could teach your friends, family, clergy, work, cohorts, what would you want them to know? And that's what we created, is an entire 6 months journey of learning the real experiences of widows. And so it creates better support for the widow, but it also makes her feel more understood and seen and heard. And so that's our little secret.
Carolyn Moor is the founder and president of Modern Widows Club, the movement for widow care. Coming up, a guide to area attractions outside of the theme parks that Central Floridians will appreciate. We want to engage with you. Let us know what you would like to hear more about, maybe what you're glad you heard. Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Love them or hate them, our theme parks are critical to the tourism industry in Central Florida. AAA recently reported that Orlando is the #1 top travel destination in the country. Susan and Simon Vaness have written a number of guidebooks about the secrets of the theme parks. Now the husband and wife are traveling off the beaten path with their new project, co-authoring 111 places in Orlando that you must not miss. In the book, they are unearthing some hidden gems in Central Florida and telling stories that even surprised them after living here 2 decades. From secret bars to Bob Ross tributes and even that eyesore on I-4, they are sharing history and sites significant to Central Florida outside of the theme parks. Susan and Simon Vaness joined Engage to guide us through some of the spots tourists and residents may not know about. Simon began our conversation by noting that many of the attractions in and around Orlando are products of the region's past.
I think the history behind the city, the creation of the city, is a story that most people don't know, because the modern face is so different to the way it was established. And at the same time, you have the African American history and culture of the city, which existed side by side with the downtown area. So we were able to bring in strands like Eatonville, the Ocoee massacre, Paramore,
Nikki's Place.
Nikki's Place in Paramore, the food, the history, the Mount Zion Baptist Church, the Wells Built Museum. There is so much crossover between one strand of Orlando's heritage and another. And when we just felt that this, once you started opening up these sort of boxes, as it were, everything sort of melded together into one coherent narrative that basically just tells the story of Orlando. And we thought that was a really compelling way to approach the book.
I've been here for several years, and I definitely learned about places I already knew about, such as the Majesty Building. Didn't know that was the eyesore on I-4.
Yes.
Yes. You couldn't really ignore that one, because
No.
it's just such an obvious thing that people would either know about and want to know more about, or just have no idea what this building is that's been sitting there for 20 plus years being built.
So when you're making this list, you're narrowing it down, adding in, taking out places, getting it to 111 places. Can you talk about a couple of things that didn't make the list, maybe why they were cut?
Yeah, there were several that didn't. I mean, because the 111 places is very much a set formula, there were some things that we couldn't include, or we couldn't include too many of. We wanted to do more on the restaurant side of things in Orlando, but the formula to work in, you can't do more than a certain number of things in any given sort of section, whether it's restaurants, museums, nightclubs, things like that. We were restricted to keeping a balance of the various different ideas and sectors that they include in their book series. So someone like Beefy King didn't make the cut in the end, even though it's kind of an Orlando tradition in terms of food downtown. There were a few other restaurants we would have liked to have included as well, things that are really unusual. But at the end, we just had too many of those, and a few of the museums that didn't make the cut that we thought would be fun to include. But by the time we added up the ones that we thought were essential to get in there, places like the Manello Museum, Orlando Art Museum, the Morse Museum in Winter Park, which is really one of our favorites. By the time we put all those together, it was, we had a full complement of what we could include.
But again, with that, as far as museums go, there had to be something about it that even a local may not know. So everybody knows the Orlando Science Center, but not everybody knows that it contains the Pooseum, which is the largest collection of coprolites, which is dinosaur poo. So the museums, there were a lot of museums that we would like to have included because they're terrific museums, but they had to also have a story or something about them that locals may not know.
I believe in the book, the phrase you used was that you saw Orlando grow up before your eyes. How has Orlando grown up before your eyes?
Ooh.
I mean, Susan's probably the best person to answer this, because she's been coming to Orlando since Walt Disney World opened in 1971. So I think you'll
I didn't spend a lot of time in downtown Orlando. I've been coming to the theme park since then, but you really saw the huge changes on Church Street. You really saw, but we've also seen we've seen more inclusivity than Orlando originally had, so that's a big change.
I mean, the growth of downtown, if you like, the growth of the various districts downtown that kind of give it the essential underpinning of a genuine, vibrant, ongoing community. That's certainly been something which has happened in the last 20 years or so. It's had the germ of it there for a long time, but certainly the amount of areas in, when you talk about the Mills 50 district, the Milk district, the Antiques Row, places like this, they've really come together coherently in the last 20 years and given, I think, the city a lot more sense of community and identity, which may well have been lacking through the 1980s and 1990s. Certainly when I first started coming here, there wasn't a whole lot to draw people away from the obvious tourist areas, the theme parks and iDrive. Church Street Station was obviously one of those big stories that even the tourist companies couldn't ignore and, included for many visitors, whether they were domestic or international, they included a way to actually go and see Church Street and see a little bit of downtown Orlando. Church Street itself obviously has changed dramatically since the 1990s. But then the influx of the urban component of downtown, that's happened pretty much sort of in the same time as Church Street was going down. The urban residential component was coming up, and that's been another major change that's really interesting to see.
When I first started coming here in the early 70s, it was a cow town. It was an orange grove town. And Magic Kingdom was the only thing that was open. But you drove down what just seemed like this long, miles long road to actually get to the toll booth for the Magic Kingdom. And there was nothing there. There was nothing around it. There was a little Holiday Inn hotel and a few sort of small gift shops and not a lot else. I mean, it's not Orlando downtown, but it was pretty much what was going on here. It was very much a rural looking area.
The story of Orlando is one of those things that a lot of people don't really consider in terms of the how it got to where it is now. And one of those essential, if you like, strings, the strands that pull things together was the number of people that have been behind various business and industrial areas, but especially the entrepreneurs and the philanthropists who have helped to give Orlando a really solid community-focused base. And I'm thinking of people like Dr. Phillips and the Liu family, who basically bequeathed the Liu Gardens to the city. There are several more examples of people who have given their time and resources to the city to really help it develop into the kind of modern urban landscape that's very appealing, totally ignoring the theme parks, and that really give it its own character and essence. And that's the kind of thing that we think most visitors certainly don't consider. And it may be that a lot of locals, especially because the influx residentially in Central Florida has been enormous in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's probably a lot of people who don't realize why it is the city it is at the moment. And I think when you know some of these backstories and some of these places that contribute to the overall appeal of the city, it just makes everything more dynamic and more sort of community focused. There is an essential friendliness and sense of community that Orlando has as a city that I don't know that you find in many big urban areas. And I think that Orlando's unique growth and history is the reason for that. And the more people know about it, the more it draws you into the city and makes you appreciate what's here.
We hope the book opens people's eyes to what the unusual things that are here. The Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive, the section of the big Orlando Public Library that's devoted to the creation of Walt Disney World, the alien bathroom at Maxine's on
Yes.
Shine. Just open your eyes and look at what's around you and then discover the backstory behind these things.
Yeah, the things like the Lunacy alpaca farm, the fact that you can go and pet alpacas is something that I'm sure most people don't realize you can do here. And it's just another of these little, really enjoyable threads that interweave through the whole of the fabric of the city. It sounds terribly pompous, I know, but there is a real general feeling of well-being about the city of Orlando, that when you stop and take a step back and look at it and look at these stories, it just makes you go, this is why I like to live here.
Susan and Simon Vaness wrote the new book, 111 Places in Orlando That You Must Not Miss. That's all for today's edition of Engage. We're back Tuesday at 3 o'clock. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. Just a reminder, we want to engage with you. Let us know what you want to talk about, what you like that you heard, maybe what you didn't like. You can send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org or send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. In the menu, select Send Us a Talkback, record your question or comment and your feedback, hit send. It will be sent right to us. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for the company. All Things Considered is coming up next, right after NPR News.